So this is a conversation with Kate Zen. She's an organizer with Red Canary Song, a US-based grassroots Asian sex workers collective. I wanted to have this conversation with Kate after watching a webinar in which she participated and in which she argued for the importance of transnational solidarity in the context of advocating for sex workers' rights. We spoke about such things as criminalization of sex work and why we should oppose it, about base building, and about mutual aid in the context of COVID-19. Kate gave us a background into why Red Canary Song came into being and how they've been trying to organize transnationally with Asian sex workers across the diaspora in Toronto, Paris, Hong Kong, New York, and so on. So I really hope you enjoyed this conversation and you find it as valuable as I have. And yeah, thank you for listening. So as usual, you can follow the podcast on Twitter at FridayStimes, and if you like what I do, please consider supporting this project with only $1 a month on Patreon on buymeacoffee.com, and you can also do so directly on PayPal if you prefer. Patreon is for monthly, PayPal is for one-offs, and Buy Me Coffee has both options. And if you cannot donate, you can still help by reviewing this podcast on Apple Podcasts or wherever you get your podcasts. Thank you.
Kate Zen, and I am a co-founder of Red Canary Song, which is a collective of sex workers, Asian sex workers, based in Flushing, Queens, New York. I've been a sex worker rights advocate for a little over 15 years now, and I've also worked as a labor rights organizer with street vendors and domestic workers, both in the United States, in New York, and in Canada, Montreal and Toronto.
Thanks for having this conversation with me. Can we just start with some background into the collective? So Red Canary Song Collective, how did it come about and when, and just kind of like general context?
Yeah, so Red Canary Song started through the Justice for Yang Song protests. There was a sex worker by the name of Song Yang, she was working on 40th Road in Flushing, which is for a long time a red light district of Flushing, Queens. And she was killed during a police raid on her workplace in November of 2017. Following her death, there were many protests that were happening by several different groups, not just our group. But this created a lot of awareness of this issue. She had previously reported being forced to give sexual services at gunpoint by someone who she believed to be an undercover cop. And she also reported that she was being compelled to be an informant on other workers in her workplace. Given this is the landscape of a lot of police corruption in Flushing, specifically with the 109th precinct, and there had already been several reports of extortion of women working at karaoke bars, and people who have complained before of being forced to give discounts to police officers. What happened to Song Yang and the very public, vivid way in which her death was shown, on the street of Flushing, it attracted a lot more attention to this issue. Our group organized around, the same time as Decrim New York was growing and as a movement in New York City, where a lot of different allied groups that had been working on the issue of sex worker rights in concert with other issues of LGBTQ rights and criminal justice reform came together to pass a bill that would decriminalize sex work in New York State. Our background, and specifically our organizing framework, came from the work of Butterfly in Toronto, where I had been organizing prior to coming back home to New York City. Butterfly is another collective of migrant sex workers, Asian migrant sex workers, that was led by a woman, Eileen Lam, who was, prior to being in Toronto, the director of Jiten, which is a sex worker collective in Hong Kong. So she spent 10 years working in Hong Kong with mostly migrant sex workers coming from the mainland into Hong Kong, who were very disenfranchised there. And she had already been doing this sort of regional work, bringing together sex worker collectives in Thailand, in Myanmar, in Vietnam and Cambodia, and also in Hong Kong. So she brought that existing knowledge and experience with her to Toronto, and I think for me, it was an amazing experience to learn from her, and also to meet migrants that were going through a path, a journey. Many had come from rural China, and then were working in the city in China due to the restrictions on labor. A lot of them had to work illegally because in China you need everyone is kind of regulated by their registration number. So if you are coming from the rural countryside and trying to work in the city, then you would be like an undocumented worker within China. So you have, certain sex worker activists like Ye Haiyan complaining, advocating against the sort of conditions that migrants within China were working under. Some of these women were, then moving to Hong Kong if they had the opportunity to travel to do so. And they were greeted, by organizations like Eileen Lamb's in Hong Kong. And then you see, some women in Toronto. Eileen started her organization because she met some of the same members that she had known in Hong Kong in Toronto, and they started collectivizing there. And some of these women have, actually traveled through Flushing, New York. And so you have this migratory pattern where people who have been deeply disenfranchised, throughout the last, few decades of China's development, that has been helpful for some, but also very, very unequal and oppressing for others. You have these people running for opportunity in other places, and due to their status, finding a lot of mistreatment by society, by governments, faced with like police brutality, faced with a lot of economic and political injustice. And so the creation of Red Canary in Flushing was our effort to try to be one more stop along the way, one more part of this bigger puzzle of disenfranchised women migrating and seeking opportunity in other places. And so we very much tried to create our organization under this similar model that Butterfly has built in Toronto.
So I want us to get a bit into the importance of representation, because on the website, one of the slogans is like nothing about us without us. But before doing that, would you mind just giving some background into like your own, again, like with as much details as you can, obviously, or you want. You mentioned that you started in Toronto, or was it in Hong Kong first?
Yeah, so I am a former sex worker myself, but for much of my, I guess, early years in my 20s, I kept that very quiet and was an activist engaged in other labor movements. So my mother, when I was a child, my mother was a garment worker, and I got to witness some of the early like protests in like the early 2000s, late 90s that were within Chinatown. And with the organizations that tried to collect wages for folks. My mom also, after the garment factory was actually closed down, and she was owed back wages after it closed down, she started working other places and as a domestic worker and other places where she could get some income. And so I also saw sort of the aftermath of failed labor struggles, or labor struggles that never got to, and what happens to some of the workers that are impacted by that. And I saw, some of the first organizing I did was with domestic worker rights organizations as a young adult. And I think all of this hits very close to home. And I always wanted to really focus more on the full lives of migrant women, of migrants, rather than necessarily pigeonholing people to a particular profession, especially because for many migrants, all of these jobs are temporary, and people have other aspirations beyond the work that they're doing to survive at the moment. And I think that's very important to think about, especially when it comes to sex work, because sex work is such a stigmatizing profession that people end up being stuck with that label, even if it's just for a brief time in their lives. And so for many migrants in sex work, this is something they do not want to create a permanent identity around. This is something that for a lot of people is a passing point, that is not something they even want to think back on once they've left the industry. And yet, as a result of that, there's a lack of, advocacy. There's a lack of, it makes it very hard to do collectivization or organizing because people don't want to have an association with the industry, and they want to be able to make money in order to get somewhere else. So in terms of my personal organizing, I actually thought early on in my early 20s, I worked as an organizer for the street vendor project in New York City, and I thought about some of the commonalities between street vendors and sex workers. Many street vendors were also experiencing a lot of police harassment and brutality. When I was there, we were working around the case of Chinese art vendors in Times Square who had these tables where they were painting pictures of people's like names or drawing people's names on on grains of rice. And we saw that there was over targeting and over ticketing of certain Asian street vendors. And we saw that the police were pretty much picking on these vendors because the vendors didn't speak English well, would just pay the tickets and would just deal with it time and time again. Meanwhile, there were American vets that were also vending on the same street and doing the same work. And they were men, and they were, they fought back. And as a result, they were not ticketed nearly as much by police. And so what you see is, when work is in this sort of region of a gray zone where it's kind of semi-criminalized, there's not enough licenses, there's not street vendors in New York City most of them do not have the license to vend because those licenses were capped in the 70s. So most people either have to buy a license off the gray market at many, many times the actual price, or they just simply face the risk of arrest every single day in their work. And police then get to pick and choose who do they want to pick on, because they are in that moment, because of criminalization, they are the judge and the jury, and they are the entire criminal justice system in one person. And as a result, you have very clear racial discrimination. Police have their own quotas that they need to meet. They get compensated extra for their overtime and being able to make more of these arrests. And so they pick on the people who are most vulnerable. And, you see in the case of both street vendors and migrant sex workers that people who are women, who have language barriers, who are easily intimidated, get picked on over and over again, sometimes, often by the same cops because they know that they can get those people. And you hear these stories over and over again in Flushing where sex workers say that, they're being harassed by the same cop over and over again. And, there's even really terrible stories about cops who realize that after a while they can get their way with these women and they can make bargains, like I won't arrest you this time if you do this thing, or and this is all too common, right? Not just in Flushing, but we hear about this everywhere across the country, in Canada, and other places around the world. Because of criminalization, women who are working in the sex industry become then at the hands of police officers who can do what they like. And so I think, within the US context, this is particularly disturbing because the US, a lot of the narrative in the United States when it comes to sex work is actually one of human trafficking. Yeah. And the American public claim to have this deep care for women who they believe are forced to do this work against their will, or they see the public narrative right now is one of protecting victims, and yet criminalization is what is putting people at the hands of not only people who may be trying to take their labor and take a portion of it for themselves, or people who, because of the lack of, police protection or the fear of police being involved, are robbing sex workers or are mistreating sex workers. But also police themselves are complicit in this picture of women who over and over again, by every person they encounter in society seem to be taken advantage of. And so the biggest hypocrisy is, these anti-trafficking organizations that are not trying to decriminalize sex work, but are rather contributing to, the criminalization of it, while being basically profiting from the nonprofit work that they're doing. You have really well-paid people within these organizations that are spreading often very racist ideas about what trafficking looks like, who to target, and they are working hand in hand with police to increase the amount of targeting and police violence against Asian communities, against Asian sex workers, or other, Black and brown sex workers, with their propaganda that almost always portrays Asian workers, and instead of helping these workers, what you have is increased deportations, is
Mm-hmm.
increased criminalization, is actually putting people, in danger, and sometimes even losing their lives. So we want to, our group, formed around wanting to shed light on this hypocrisy and fight back against it, because what we see over and over again is if you don't fight back, then you're going to be taken advantage of. And so many Asian workers, there's a lack of representation in advocacy, and a lack of people just pushing back against these unjust systems.
Along those same lines, can we talk a bit about why there is the slogan "Nothing about us without us"? Basically, essentially, can we talk a bit about the importance of actually having representation and actual, like, real representation, not just token representation in these spaces of people who say that they care about sex workers being exploited or whatnot, and yet very rarely actually talk to sex workers, let alone platform them.
This is a very important slogan within the sex worker rights movement, especially during the 90s and 2000s, where there was suddenly the emergence of this big anti-trafficking sector that, kind of rose in the United States hand in hand with anti-terrorism. So after 9/11, you'll see media kind of saliency around trafficking grow in proportion with other sorts of campaigns to increase, funding for police, to increase funding for militarization and for surveillance. And trafficking is, very, very easy and bipartisan issue for lawmakers to get behind, because who in their right minds would go against something so terrible as the abduction of women, or the rape of women? And so,
Mhm.
you know what you see is this like burgeoning NGO sector that employs a lot of upper middle class people who have no real connection to people working in the sex industry, that are advocating for greater criminalization, that work hand in hand with police, that have created organizations where they specifically give data over to the police when they are giving social services, which many of these organizations don't even do. So many of these organizations are awareness raising organizations. So their entire purpose is to create propaganda that is often racist and untrue, and that justifies somehow their existence. For the ones that do give social services, there's been a huge problem with, their willingness to work with police and to hand data over to police, and the creation of this category of trafficking victim is contingent upon the victim being able to name and prosecute a trafficker, which, human trafficking really is a crime against the state rather than a crime against a particular victim. It is a crime in which the state then is able to use this to be able to offer, say, trafficking visas or other forms of, alleviation in order to then go after what is considered the real criminal. But the problem in the sex trade is that the kinds of difficulties that women encounter and the kinds of labor issues that people are encountering are often not so black and white. It is not something where you can say, this is a trafficker and this is someone who's being victimized as a trafficked person. Instead, you have, gray areas where, yes, people are working in in difficult conditions, oftentimes with long hours, and there are issues with that, much like other forms of immigrant labor. But when you take a criminalization lens to it and you use the broad stroke of policing, what you do is you actually make it impossible for people to report the day-to-day, more minute forms of labor exploitation, whether it is long hours or being taken, too much of their wages being taken by the boss. These similar kinds of labor exploitation that, say, women in doing in nail salon work or domestic work are also encountering, are impossible to actually fix when it comes to sex work, because criminalization of sex work means that sex workers have no labor bargaining power. And on top of that, if they report anything, everyone gets arrested. And if it gets framed as a form of trafficking, which, in this industry, anything like, these sorts of labor stories are only seen in the light of trafficking, then these women are subject to a process in which they could be deported unless they tell the police who their trafficker is. They only get these protections like T visas or other kinds of, like, they're usually under the criminal justice system as someone who is a criminal first, and then they're offered this way of buying themselves out of the system if they can name the bigger criminal. And the problem is, if you look at a lot of these massage parlors and places where people work, a lot of these are owned by women who are former sex workers. A lot of times sex workers are coming into this country because, a friend of theirs who are from their same hometown said, come here and work with me and you will make a lot of money. And so these are not relationships that are, generally seen by women who are working there as something like violent and exploitative. And so for them to give up a friend or the person they're working with as a criminal and understand the types of consequences that will happen for that person, that's not something that a lot of people working in this industry are willing to do to someone they don't perceive in that way. And so as a result, people who are swept up in these anti-trafficking raids then have to take the crime and the punishment themselves. So by being unwilling to name a trafficker, then they are, a sex worker, they are a prostitute, they are the one that is breaking the law. And yeah, under the US federal law with immigration, prostitution is deemed, wrong under the moral turpitude clause. So anyone that has come into this country as a migrant and is doing sex work is definitely is illegal. And so so for people that are caught up in this, if you can't prove you're a trafficking victim, then you are a criminal that is punishable by very high degree. And instead of offering substantive help that is centered around the actual needs and stories and the actual helpful measures that people in this very exploited labor sector are asking for, instead the anti-trafficking movement tends to center the saviors. They tend to center these cops that are supposed to come in and rescue everyone. They center these nonprofit industry, upper middle class, charitable foundations that are about like their own efforts of being heroes. And it's a very classist narrative. And so, this ends up sucking up a lot of attention and money as well. Like funding will go only towards organizations where there is such a savior. It tends to bolster funding for military and, police. So the Justice for Victims of Trafficking Act of 2014, if you look in depth into where the actual like appropriations of funding go for these anti-trafficking bills, most of the money are not going towards services for migrant workers. Instead, it goes towards creating Hero Corps in the police, which is veterans that are able to have a new job in the police, going after sex trafficking.
Is that what it's called?
It's called the Hero Corps. Yeah, and it's written into the it's written into the JVTA, the Justice for Victims of Trafficking Act.
Okay.
On top of that, you have the creation of a cyber crimes unit under ICE, under immigration, and the allowance for wiretapping, all in the name of trying to prevent trafficking. But really, it's about surveillance of immigrants. It's about giving more money to law enforcement in a way that quickly gets very, very quickly goes through the lawmaking process, because no lawmaker wants to have on their record that they voted against a trafficking bill. So, the people who have the most to lose in all of this inevitably are like migrant sex workers, are sex workers who have no voice, who instead are taken advantage of on all sides, including by these nonprofits that claim to speak for them. And so this sort of mantra of, of nothing about us without us, comes out of sex workers not only organizing here but around the world. There is increasingly like more and more communication between sex worker organizations in Asia, in Africa, Latin America, North America. And so groups like NSWP, the Global Network of Sex Work Projects, try to coordinate communication and try to do research on like what policies work under different types of regimes. And everywhere people are saying nothing about us without us, because the kinds of policies that are made, without sex workers involved at the table, are almost always incredibly harmful to sex workers.
I'm also guessing that this would include the well, so-called feminists who oppose sex work by actually, if not if not openly supporting criminalization, but at least being very silent about it. And so the reason why I'm saying this is because while preparing for this episode, I was talking to a number of friends of mine, all fairly well-seasoned activists, I think, and feminist activists in most of them in the context of Lebanon, a couple of them in the context of Egypt. And I asked them, like, what would you want to know from basically from this episode, like from me asking you? And they said, like, how do we decouple the misconceptions from people who, putting aside those who are ill-meaning, let's put them aside for a sec, those who might be well-meaning, but who don't actually understand that going through the criminalization route is actually doing much, much more harm than good. Basically, how do you actually tackle this? I struggle to even call it a misconception, because I mean, I guess it is a misconception, but it has such severe consequences.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think, for the people that are increasingly, I think the anti-trafficking movement is becoming aware of this issue.
Mm-hmm.
Like in the United States, in the last like 20 years, the anti-trafficking movement was composed of a strange alliance between like the fundamental religious right and feminist groups and like very pro-military, pro-police groups coming together in this very weird way to sort of, highlight the issues that they see are happening in the sex industry. Increasingly, that attention is given not only to the sex industry now, but to forced labor in general, which is, I think, where the attention should go. When it comes to domestic work or farm work, you have a lot of migrants coming in that are tied to prohibitive visas that make it so their hosts can take advantage of them, their employers can take advantage of them, and also, increasingly people are seeing that the ways in which to approach those issues, you have to actually look at the immigration system and look at what categories are putting people at risk. You can't tackle something like sex trafficking without also looking at the immigration system, and if you only focus on like the bad guys or like criminal justice, you're missing the real picture here of why people are at risk and why people are vulnerable. So work that anti-trafficking activists are doing in looking at immigration law and looking at labor rights for all workers, including workers that do not have status. What are the mechanisms in place to regulate and to inspect and to make sure that these workplaces are free from oppression, from harm? I think those are the same kinds of measures that need to be extended to the sex industry. If you look at domestic work or farm work, you would never suggest that to stop the forced labor of domestic workers, you need to arrest, go into everybody's homes and and arrest anyone that might potentially be at risk, and including people who are working of their own volition. In order to stop the exploitation of farm workers, you wouldn't say prohibit the sale of all produce, because produce might be done by people who are forced to work in terrible conditions, right? So, but for the sex industry, for some reason, the conclusion is, in order to get rid of situations where there's forced labor, you have to raid all the workplaces of sex workers. You have to criminalize the sale of any type of sexual exchange, even when that is something that is like a bread and butter for people to survive. And so those kinds of measures are just the logic that is enforced on the sex industry is so different, and it makes no sense from the way that you would tackle the same problems for immigrant workers in other industries. And so I think the more that activists who care about this issue are looking at the different systemic ways in which immigrant workers are made vulnerable, and what realistic systems can be put in place to protect those workers, and then extending that to sex workers, I think that is, but the best way to actually work on this issue.
If you were talking about just your own experience in New York and Toronto and Hong Kong, if I would just ask you, like, how can base building through this labor rights framework, so to emphasize the work component, the labor component, sorry, let me simplify it. I'm sorry, maybe I'm just complicated for no reason. How would you explain base building, basically, for those who don't really know how it works?
Okay, so base building is a process. The word comes out of like Saul Alinsky tenant organizing in Chicago, and is part of this a model of building political power with people power, rather than centered around politicians, or centered around resources, money, the nonprofit industrial complex. The idea around base building is that all power should be centered on the experiences of people, and the more that you get people together little by little through this methodology of knocking on doors, having these one-on-one conversations, making the ask of asking people to join in a meeting, building a sense of camaraderie through those meetings that are social in nature, but also then help people to see their life circumstances in a politicized way, and see their daily experiences of oppression as part of a bigger system. Then taking that analysis and a few people within these meetings that stay on and decide to become members of your organization, to then build and create analysis that is not coming from an academic standpoint, from top to bottom, but rather from a grounded way of people's just daily circumstances and lives and how they experience the world. This is all part of a model of building people power that we refer to when we talk about base building. In terms of looking at sex work from a labor angle, besides, I think, being a sex worker and doing organizing within sex worker circles, how would a labor angle look for people outside of sex work? I think one way of examining this is actually to look at the way that patriarchal marriage has created a division of labor, where women have been forced traditionally to do reproductive labor for free. It is a form of expected forced labor, if you will. Marriage itself, as the marriage contract, is a way of forcing the reproductive labor, the domestic work, the sexual labor of women, and keeping women locked out of the economic system, through prohibition of women owning property, which has been throughout the world, the case throughout most of history. Keeping women from being able to participate in public life has meant that women have no option but to depend on their husbands. And then putting on top of that an ideological way to enforce that type of forced labor, so that it is tied upon women's reputations, so that so that sluthood or any type of sexuality that is not abiding by this heteronormative obedience to the person you are married to, then makes you the worst type of human being, right? You said this word is like animal, like it's subhuman. That is an ideological way of enforcing reproductive labor within a very patriarchal system that gives power to men, in which women's sexuality are actually the ownership, the property right of men, right? And so for sex workers throughout history, for whatever reason, whether it is because of widowhood, which is a common reason why a lot of women have engaged in sex work, or divorce, or circumstances for migrant women where they're seeking a different life outside of a place where they have any citizenship or any rights, and they need to rely on themselves. This way of rebelling against the property rights established on women's sexuality by men is punished through the criminalization of sex work, and it's punished in a very, very violent way throughout history. We are now at a point in history in some parts of the world where the mores around the practice of sexuality outside of marriage has loosened.
Mm-hmm.
This is a sexual revolution in the 1960s, primarily in European and North American places, but also increasingly all over the world.
Mm-hmm.
And now that part of the ideological enforcement on women's obedience to patriarchal sexual values has been loosened, it causes people to question more what exactly is wrong with sex work, right?
Mm-hmm.
What exactly is wrong with women doing one of the few things that they are actually paid more than men for doing, right? And I think this is an interesting point, because I think we're at a point in history where the hypocrisies around our judgments of the sex industry and of prostitution are becoming more and more evident. And the liberation of sex workers is that weird crack in the system of patriarchy, where it highlights so many of the different contradictions, right? The contradictions of marriage, the contradictions of class. And so I think what's really interesting and what's really powerful about sex workers organizing, doing this base building work, talking to each other, is that it sits at the intersection of so many different social movements, on LGBTQ rights movement. So many sex workers, in the United States, like there are many trans sex workers who have used sex work to pay for their operations. And of course, sex work itself completely contradicts a lot of the norms around around non-heteronormative sex. It also, in the United States, is very much a racial justice issue, because the criminalization of sex work is so disproportionate depending on if you are a race that is being targeted by police or if you are not. Many white and quote unquote elite sex workers don't really suffer the harms of criminalization almost at all. And they are only brought to light when someone is going after a politician and they become the weak link in another scandal, right? And so there's so much hypocrisy in the prosecution of sex work as a crime, depending on race. On top of that, in the US, it highlights, of course, many issues of classism. So sex work is also something that is always existed, but oftentimes it's a lower class of women that have had to do sex work even as they were in married life. So this idea that marriage and sex work are incompatible is essentially a very classist notion. If you look at New York City at the turn of the century, 1800s, when Emma Goldman, the feminist anarchist activist, was talking about why it's important to support sex worker rights. She's one of the earlier theorists on this. This was a time when it was said that 1 in 4 women, lower class women, I guess, in lower Manhattan in New York City, was engaged in sex work, and brothels were everywhere. Mm-hmm. And so it was just a form of work that was almost, for the women that were moving into urban environments, trying to make a living, often working in really low paid garment work and finding it to be insufficient. Sex work was everywhere. And it was this idea that women were either married and good women or sex workers wasn't true for the working class. Many working class women were working and were sex workers. And it's a kind of a bourgeois notion of the good woman versus the bad woman, where only people who are, upper middle class who can afford it could be good women protected by good husbands, and everyone else just had to work. And I think this is still the case now. You have, majority of sex workers have other relationships, are mothers, are taking care of an entire life that is separate from this very abstract binary that we have of women either being sex workers or being the good kind of women. Most women who are in the sex industry are everything, and you can't summarize any typical sex worker, because I think sex work is more divided internally based on circumstance, race, sex, class. Then you can find some commonality between all sex workers. And so I think right now at this moment, and it's I think a very interesting moment in the U.S. sort of social justice history, in that the last 10 years, you've seen the Occupy movement changing conversations about 1%, 99%, and bringing more class consciousness. You
Mm-hmm.
have LGBTQ movement and the gay, marriage being approved by the Supreme Court in 2015. And then increasingly after that, after gay marriage got approved, people started questioning even more. Like, the queer rights, queer liberation movement is asking for more than, equality in marriage. They're looking for rights for people who are like trans, who are
Mm-hmm.
choose to be, outside of the whole system entirely, do not want marriage because marriage itself is oppressive in a lot of ways. And then, this is shifting the conversation and opening up ways for sex worker rights, for the things that people within the sex worker rights movement have been saying for all time, forever, to be given another look, right? And the mainstream media is much more receptive now to sex worker rights because of the attention to the rights of trans people, right? And then on top of that, I think in the US, since the BLM movement in late 2014, 2015 to today, like, people are more aware than ever of racism and criminalization and policing, incarceration.
Mm-hmm.
And so as a result, turning a gender lens on policing and incarceration, you see that the majority of women that are being charged with crime are being charged with crime within like sex industry. And so right now, I think sex work is at a moment where suddenly it is at the intersection of many social movements that have been active and that are getting attention, and and as a result, like, defending the rights of sex workers also
Mm-hmm.
means defending all these other social justice movements as well. But it wasn't always this way, and I can definitely remember just being an organizer years ago, where it felt to me like it would be impossible to fight for sex worker rights because it is so far behind in what is considered a priority, what is considered like a fightable cause,
Right.
that there was no way to bring people to even have this analysis. And I think what's really incredible about like 2020 is that people are ready to really listen to all these different arguments. They care about immigrant rights. They see these sort of ways in which like global inequalities have put people in this non-human status, which is, that is the worker status that people often come into sex work in. When people are undocumented, when people are coming out of incarceration, where they are not given full citizenship, sex work being also seen as a non-human place, a non-human destination, then becomes one of the few places where people can survive, can make a living. And so I think, tackling the issues of sex work and all the injustices that people experience within it requires having that broader analysis of economic injustice as prescribed by law, immigration law, criminal law, economic injustice and trade law, the ways in which different countries are, and races are treated differently in value, and how that history post-colonialism is brought into sex work.
Mm-hmm.
I think, you know, as an Asian American like woman who is also involved in other social justice circles that look at imperialism and the impact on countries like Korea and Thailand, where you have prostitution happening alongside American military bases,
Yeah.
brought in by the police, by the American military. It's easy to be reductive in analysis and see it only as something that, like, all sex work as being a matter of imperialism, and that the only way to sort of deal with this circumstance is to criminalize the purchase of sex and all. I think with every form of labor in which there is a lot of men in that work, in Flushing, this is seen as, a lot of the day laborers who are Mexican and Latin American day laborers, who are working under very, very terrible conditions themselves. They tend to be the ones who are the customers of sex workers. Same with militarization, wherever men are gathered together in this way, which they're compelled to do a type of work that is often also forced. You have women that are working alongside them as sex workers. In the United States, the history of the railroad workers, the Chinese railroad workers who are imported into this country after the emancipation of slaves in
Mm-hmm.
1865, these railroad workers were often bachelors, and they only wanted to make a bit of money and to return home. And alongside Chinese railroad workers was, groups of Chinese sex workers. And, I think it comes down to a bigger question of forced labor, gender and forced labor, physical labor, and the imbalance in power between, European white countries and other countries, where we have to really look at the way that all labor is structured, the way that all exploitation is happening, and how women specifically feel that brunt of it in the sex trades. And you can't have that discussion by summarizing women as an abstraction, right? So a lot of times people who are anti-sex work, because they see it as a form of militarization, or they see it as a they often will portray sex workers as a metaphor of the degradation of the country, a metaphor of, in Korea, it's like, it's the foreign invasion and rape of Korea, right? And when you
Mm-hmm.
say it like that, you end up abstracting the complex lives of many people who are trying to live under a system of, of neo-colonialism, of people who are surviving, and who are forced by not always the same sort of idea of, like, physical force, but often it's just the economic violence of imperialism,
Mm-hmm.
that people are forced to do this under. And to erase that and to not give them a voice because you would prefer to use the metaphor of them instead, I think, is a big loss to a much more complex social justice conversation that we could be having.
How has Red Canary been dealing with the COVID-19 pandemic? Because, like, I mean, obviously, due to the nature of the work itself, I would imagine that workers would be fairly vulnerable to what's happening.
Yeah, so a lot of workers were deeply impacted by the increase in policing in the months before the lockdown in March.
Mm-hmm.
Um, there was a very famous case of Robert Kraft, a wealthy, like, sports team owner,
Mm-hmm.
who last year in February of 2019 was arrested with a scandal in Florida with a Chinese massage parlor. As a result of that, and due to the fact that some of the workers in this Florida massage parlor were originally from Flushing, Queens, there was kind of a nationwide, like, media attention being given to Flushing, and
Mm.
saying that it is the epicenter of human trafficking. And so that was when you saw, like, increasing raids, and so as a result of that, in Flushing and also across the country, there was more and more policing of the Asian massage parlor, not other forms of sex work, but particularly this version of it. And in the months before the lockdown actually happened, there had already been many, many months of hyper policing that was happening, that was really, really only attuned to Asian sex work in this particular format, in business models that looked like the massage parlor.
Mm-hmm.
And so that, combined with the fact that the Chinatown and Flushing communities felt the stigma of COVID-19 before anyone else. People were already reading the news about, in January, about COVID-19 in China, and they were beginning to avoid going to Chinatown.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
not going to the restaurants. Like, a lot of businesses were failing or beginning to suffer. So the same happened with Chinese massage workers. They were already feeling it months before the actual lockdown. So by
Mm.
the time the lockdown happened, a lot of businesses in Flushing had already either been cleared out by police or ran out of business because it was over, like, people weren't going.
Mm-hmm.
And so at that time, people were like, as soon as the lockdown actually happened, people were incredibly desperate. They had already gone for months without the income that they needed. So Red Canary, like, our work during this pandemic has been partnering with groups like, Legal Aid Society.
Mm-hmm.
They are lawyers that represent sex workers. They referred some of their clients to us, and we had other members refer their friends, so that we can provide groceries and some stipends that we fundraised for. This form of mutual aid, which the term again comes out of, like, like anarchist organizing,
Mm-hmm.
is about how do you provide for each other without the structures of government. And this is necessary for people for whom the government cannot be relied upon, who are criminalized, right? There is
Exactly.
no other system. Like, you can go to the police if you're harmed. So we circulate bad date lists saying, this is what happened here, this is what happened here, beware of someone who looks like that, because we already have to, we don't live in a system of police abolition, but we have to function as if the police don't exist, right?
Mm.
And same with mutual aid. Like, sex workers were not going to get any funding from the government during COVID-19. And so you have to provide our own. The idea of mutual aid, I think, has been watered down a lot during COVID-19 because everyone is claiming to do mutual aid, and it's, sharing money or raising money for each other. There is a political tradition that has more radical implications, which is
Mm-hmm.
like, how do we help each other separate from the violence of the state, of the colonial state, of the racialized, state, for people that have long been suffering under this governance, who cannot rely on the help of government or police at all. What is it like to empower each other and build community with each other, and replicate the systems that we need, without that violence, systems that
Yeah.
are actually centered on us, right?
Yeah.
So
Yeah. Okay, like this has been really, really informative. I'm really very grateful for your time. On a sort of a closing note, can you, for those who want to get involved or want to support Red Canary Song, can you kind of point them out to the website, social media? What can they follow and how can they help?
yeah, they can, so we have a new website that was just created. It's redcanarysong.net. So if you would like to support us, we would definitely appreciate your support. We are continually making distributions, as the pandemic continues. So
Mm-hmm.
more support is always helpful. Our Twitter account and Instagram account is at Red Canary Song. And yeah, I think, being active wherever you are and supporting sex workers in the location you are, and, doing more research into, understanding why this issue is important for so many movements, is also a way of like helping us. I think the more that we have people understanding this, not in the United States, but like everywhere, and combating the sort of patriarchal ways in which people are living, that is also helpful for us, because I think, at the end of the day, we are all living in this world together, where we have to fight these systems together. So.
Absolutely. And I would also add to that the resource section of the website is incredibly useful. And I would urge everyone listening to this to check that out as well.
Wonderful.
Awesome.
Thank you so much.